Hello to you all, and welcome to this live conversation coming to you from the Economist's offices on the edge of Mayfair in London. I'm Mark Johnson, the Economist's community editor, and with me also is Rob Gifford, who is the editor of our China section. Also with us on the line are several readers who have kindly accepted our invitation to pose their questions about China, about its rise, and about our coverage to Rob in person. So thank you, all of you, for joining with us, and we're hoping for a fairly broad-ranging discussion. Let me start by posing one or two questions to Rob myself. The Economist has only had a section dedicated to China for, well, about 6 months now, maybe not even that. What principles for you guide our coverage of the country?
Well, I think just looking back at Western media coverage of China over the years, going back obviously to the Cold War, it was fairly straightforward because China was a rather black and white country, and so coverage tended to be rather black and white. What's happened in the last 20 years, especially, is that China has become a completely multicolored country, and what you've got is a society and an economy that are completely being transformed. And so the idea behind the section itself was to try to broaden our coverage of China, to get away. Obviously, we'll be covering politics, and we do cover the politics and the diplomacy and some of those high-end, high politics things, but we're trying to cover more the diversity as well of China, the social fabric, if you like, some of the social economic issues and where they interact with political life as well.
Well, thank you. And with apologies, I am going to jump in with the first question, which is on the political life, although I'm sure we'll come to culture and society later on. Our cover leader this week of The Economist, which is to be published in about a few hours, is about the anti-Japan riots that have broken out in China, related to the ongoing dispute over the sovereignty of several islands that lie between them. I wanted to ask you what you think these riots tell us about China, if anything, about the mindset there at the moment, and indeed how likely you think it is that this dispute is going to escalate into something that is potentially more serious.
Well, it seems very obvious to say, but it's worth saying because it is very important, that it shows that the Chinese are very, very nationalistic. And one of the themes that you'll see in The Economist this week is the comparison with Europe 100 years ago, the nationalism that emerged out of the 19th century. And of course, we all know where that ended up in 1914. And so obviously it's an imperfect comparison, it's not completely the same, but it's looking at that nationalistic side. In China, because there is no ideological legitimacy anymore, no one really believes in communism anymore, because there's no popular legitimacy, there are no elections, they have relied on economic legitimacy, the fact that your life is going to get a little bit better or a lot better as a result of economic reform. As the economy is slowing, that is something that is changing, as well as the natural emergence of nationalism just as the country develops. That's what happens when industrial revolutions go on. But the government is specifically using it as well to shore up its own legitimacy at home, to present itself as the champion of the rising Chinese state. As to whether it's going to lead to big problems internationally, I think probably not. I think, well, it's going to be an ongoing saga. I'm sure we'll see more flare-ups, but I think they are under no illusions as to how important their international relationships are, and they're under no illusions about how much damage could be done to their economic development and indeed their world standing and their prospects for the future of emerging in some kind of peaceful rise, as they say they want. They're under no illusions that how much that would be harmed by some kind of a military incident. But having said that, just look back at 1913. It would have just been stupid to go to war, right? Well, we saw what happened.
I'd like to go over now to our readers who've been waiting patiently. Thank you again for joining us. And I think first I'd like to call on Javier. Perhaps you might introduce yourself, tell us where you're calling from, and pose your question to Rob.
Absolutely, yeah. My name is Javier, and I'm calling right now from Windsor, Ontario, Canada, southwestern Ontario. I'm originally from Colombia, and I lived in Europe before as well. But my concern right now is kind of touching on what Rob just said. Basically, heading or looking at where China is heading right now, with a number of factors that are confluencing right now, is with the aging population. So China's getting older, the middle class is growing, but the growth is also slowing. Do they have any real alternatives to keep this growth going other than aggressive imperialism? This sort that we already have seen some evidence in Angola, other African countries with a heavy Chinese presence right now. Is it gonna come a point where their hands will be tied and they're gonna have no alternative? And how will that affect the West?
Good question. I think they might just dispute your characterization of their presence in Angola as aggressive imperialism. I think there's a lot of issues, undoubtedly, as China has pushed out, but we have not yet seen the kind of, speaking of the 19th century, as we just were, or as I just was. We have not yet seen that kind of imperialism. I mean, economic imperialism, that's a different thing. But I think we do have to separate those two things. I don't think we're at all being Pollyanna-ish, looking at the Chinese to say, frankly, that they are not engaged in anything like the imperialism of European countries in Africa in the 19th century. Having said that, they are causing a lot of problems with their economic pushing out. They need this in order to sustain the economic development that has been going on for 30 years. They desperately need the resources, and everywhere they go, despite their best efforts sometimes, not such great efforts in other times, there are these conflicts. We have stories of Chinese mine owners in Africa shooting their workers, not integrating, dealing very, very badly often with the local populations. There are plenty of places where the integration is better. But I think it's going to be one of the big questions of the next decade, because there are inevitably going to be more problems. And of course, there are other problems as well, not just resource nationalism, not just the resources that they're trying to get. We see companies like Huawei at the upper end of the economic food chain, electronic companies, makers of equipment, who are trying to get out and to get big contracts. They've just been turned down for one in Australia because of fears of having a Chinese company installing equipment and what they might do with that, sometimes in very sensitive places. So these are big questions that are going to have to be answered. China has its work cut out to persuade the Western world, and indeed the developing world, that its intentions are good. And that is going to probably be the problem. There are, because of the legacy of history, and indeed because of some of the problems, the Chinese, a lot of people are inclined to think the worst of China. Sometimes that is fair. Sometimes, to be honest, that is not fair, because they are trying very hard to not do it in a 19th century European way. But you're quite right to put your finger on this issue. I think it's going to be one of the big issues of the next decade as China tries to emerge onto the world stage.
Thanks very much, Rob, and thank you, Javier, for your question. Let me move on now to Jeremy. Perhaps you'd introduce yourself and pose your question.
Sure. Thank you, Mark. I'm Jeremy Cook. I'm the chief economist for a currency brokerage in London called World First. And the main economic question that we're looking at, and some of our clients talk to us about, is the slowdown in China. For the past year or so, people have been talking about a a fear certainly that we would see a hard landing in China. It looks that we may have passed that, but we are still worried about the growth picture going forward in China as to whether they are able to switch away from a manufacturing economy to one based around consumption and the onset of the middle class within China. So I just wanted to get Rob's thoughts on how long the Chinese political system will be able to delay this to try and keep giving that 8 or 9% growth that they so crave before moving towards a more consumption-based economy.
Well, I mean, again, you've put your finger on one of the key questions, and again, I'm going to answer it, and not to put too much pressure on Vice President Xi Jinping, who's expected to take over as president within the coming months. But again, it is going to be one of the key questions of the next decade. When we look back, just looking big picture, I think if we look at the last 30 years, I think really that was the easy bit. They were coming from nowhere. They were coming from utter poverty. So to put in place economic reform and to reap the gains of that economic reform, which they have, has been the easy part. The problem now is that we're starting to see a need for more structural reform. They've got to the point, and we've got to the point in looking at China where I see everything that they need to do. All of these economic issues are starting to become political issues as well. And that's when it starts to get very, very sensitive in terms of, speaking more broadly, the liberalization of interest rates, as well as all sorts of things in the banking sector, as well as the issues that you point to in terms of trying to boost consumption. One thing I would say in relation to these, two things I would say in relation to that question and these big sort of economic questions. One is don't underestimate the Chinese. I have had some pessimism in the past, and I still have some big concerns about whether they can make these big structural changes. And I still do have concerns, especially politically, which is another big issue. Can they make that transition? But we do have to remember we've been in situations like this before in the 90s with banking reform still ongoing, with all sorts of areas in China's walk along this road of the last 30 years where everyone's going, oh yeah, this, let's see them get out of this one. And they have. And the thing that helps them is, of course, that they do have a high degree of control. They are in this massive country, on this massive supertanker that they're trying to turn around, and they do have some ability to do that, of course, by suppressing all sorts of things along the way. But I think the challenge of getting people to consume more, the problem with it is that it's so connected with all sorts of other issues. And that's the other thing about all these issues now. They're all connected. You can't reform them in a vacuum. What you're talking about in terms of, for instance, liberating the 700 million peasants, the people still left in the countryside, is connected to healthcare reform. Why don't those people spend? Because they have to save money for a rainy day in case they get sick. It's connected to land reform in terms of whether they can, for instance, use their land as collateral in getting loans and all sorts of things like that. So there are all these issues that are connected to how they're going to get people to spend, how they're going to boost the consumption economy, and the problem is that they can't make a move on all of them, or they're afraid in some ways to make a move on any of them because that will affect all sorts of other things that they have to do. So I think we're coming in the next 5 years to a position where they're going to have to make some much, much bigger structural decisions about how China is structured in order to get to the consumption economy that they want.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for that excellent question. And let's now move across to the other side of the Atlantic, where Danny is waiting on the line too. Danny, over to you. Hello, can you all hear me?
I certainly can.
Danny, I don't think Danny can hear us.
I can hear you.
Okay. Hi, Danny. No.
We've lost Danny. Okay, well maybe
Yeah.
that's live television for you. We'll get Danny back on the line later. In the meantime, Rob, I had a couple of questions for you from people who couldn't join us on the phones, but who have excellent questions to ask you nonetheless. And let's start with one from Lucicia Arba, who reminds us that the Chinese government has commonly made it difficult for people to access Western websites like Google, YouTube, Facebook from inside the country. How do you see the government's ability and desire to control such media changing in the medium term and indeed in the long term as well?
I think this is a complex question because I think there's generally a feeling outside China. It's just people I speak to, in Britain who maybe have never been to China, that, oh, Twitter's blocked, Facebook's blocked, oh, poor Chinese, they can't get access to anything. Actually, they've created these homegrown versions of Twitter called Weibo, homegrown versions of YouTube called Youku, and homegrown versions of Facebook, of all the social media that we have in the West. The big difference, of course, is that the Chinese government controls the switch. We've seen in the Arab Spring how dangerous it can be when you don't control the switch if you're the government. So I think the Chinese government has probably been patting itself on the back over the last year that it didn't that it did go ahead and block those Western sites, and that it has allowed only its domestic sites to grow up. The bigger, broader question of this, though, is not necessarily will social media be used to bring on the revolution, because within urban China, and indeed, down into rural China, where people are using computers now and using cell phones and smartphones, the issue is not so much, can I get on the internet to start the revolution? Most people's use of the internet in China is not political at all. What's happened is the government has given a lot more space to the people of China. They did this deal after Tiananmen Square to say, basically, you can do whatever you want as long as you stay out of politics. And guess what? After 50 years of having their lives destroyed by politics, the Chinese people bought the deal. So they are relishing having access to the internet to find a better job, to play games online, to find a girlfriend, all the things that Western people use the internet for. And the danger for the government, though, is the maturity that that is bringing to the Chinese populace, and indeed the way that it enables them to comment on non-political things. If you say down with the Communist Party on the Chinese Twitter, you will probably, or let's overthrow the party, you'll not only be censored, you'll probably get a knock on the door. But if you're writing about some issue, some local environmental corruption issue, you might get away with it. So there's much more space now for people to talk and do things and interact, and it's not a direct political threat that is most threatening to the Chinese Communist Party. It's the sort of maturing of the Chinese mind and the slow empowering of the Chinese mind and the Chinese people as they learn about interaction, they learn more about everything from the internet, but also they are able to get together and in some cases even bring down corrupt officials and have some impact on how things happen in Chinese society within the system, as long as they're not challenging the system itself.
Let's go back over to Danny, who I think has now rejoined us. Are you with us, Danny?
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me now.
Yeah, I can hear you, yeah.
Excellent. Please introduce yourself and pose your question.
My name is Danny. I'm calling from Toronto in Canada. Big fan of the paper. My question involves the steady way that China is moving into space. In the past few years, under Obama, the United States has moved to privatize their space flight and imposed huge cutbacks on NASA. And Russia right now is recovering from numerous failed launches in the past few months. At the same time, China is busy lifting their own GPS system into orbit. and preparing to send rovers to the moon, and in the middle stages of building a permanent presence in orbit in a space station. So sticking with the topic, how can this stay peaceful, and what do the Chinese hope to gain in terms of leverage and obviously resources from space or the moon?
I think you have to divide it into two. There is, of course, and especially because the Chinese space program is run by the Chinese military,
Exactly.
there are big, very close links between what the Chinese military is doing and the space program. So that could be of some concern. Missile technology, all that sort of thing, quite in addition to the issues that you raise of putting a man on the moon and all the other projects that the Chinese have. I think they've talked about wanting to go to Mars. But in addition to the sort of technological side of it, absolutely, as you put it, that China, as the West is reining in its space program, China is going flat out for it. The second important thing, and indeed the driver of that, is just the prestige of it. It's very, very symbolic. I mean, it's very concrete, the influence that it is having on their technology and possibly on their military. But I think a lot of it is symbolic. A lot of it is, you know what, you can do that, can you, in the West? Well, guess what? We are China. We invented gunpowder. We invented the compass. We invented printing. And we can put a man on the moon. Perhaps they don't spell it out quite so frankly, but subliminally, underlying all of this, this is about the re-emergence of China, re-emergence of China the Great, you know, the China of the Tang dynasty and of the Ming dynasty, you know, the place where much of civilization emerged long before it did in the Western world. So it's about reasserting itself. It's also, you know, you can find whatever you like in it. This is the thing about China. If you're an optimist and you're generally up on China and you generally think that they're a reasonable bunch of people, well, you can find reason to say, no, they're not going to use it to endanger America in any way with their missile technology or with whatever space technology it is. If you're more of a hawk, you can easily find reasons to be worried about this China's space program because of those links with the military. And that's something to be said in answer to any question that is asked about China. Part of the problem with China and part of the problem with our coverage of China generally in the West is that everything's true about China somewhere, and you can find anything to back up your own prejudices about China, whether as you know, they sometimes say, whether you're a panda hugger or a dragon slayer, you know, whether you're tough on China or you're a hawk or you're a dove. And so I think the space program is a bit like that. The problem is, as with everything, is it is so secretive. So as with Chinese politics, as with so much of China, the lack of transparency leads us to fear the worst, sometimes for good reason, and that is a real problem because that obviously breeds suspicion, as indeed China's space program has done among some scientists in the West.
Yeah, it seems like the real military side of it is hidden.
That's right.
More or less.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is, and it's. I mean, I've been out to the launch site, near the launch site in the Gobi Desert, and you can't get near to it. You know, it's very. I mean, to some extent, that's true of all launch sites, and there's a certain amount of secrecy. But in China, it's multiplied by 10 or 20, and we've seen that in the last 2 weeks. You know, the man who's about to become the president of China goes missing, and nobody's seen him, and he's not in the news for 2 weeks. I mean, it's just China kind of catching up. That as China gets more important, and it is important. Well, here's the thing: you want a convertible currency. You want to play more of a role in the world. You're looking to get out more. Well, well, fast forward 20 years, if you don't start to open up the way your political culture works, I mean, imagine if China did have a convertible currency. Imagine if it had, a reserve currency in the renminbi, and the president went missing for 2 weeks. These kind of things impact the way you're seen and the way your country can function internationally, and they need to get hold of how to deal with this and how to open up the political culture a little bit more, if only to allay people's worst suspicions and stop people saying, oh, you see, China, they're so secretive, they're always up to no good.
Thanks very much for your question, Danny. And it appears we have one final last joiner. Deepak, hello, can you hear me?
I can.
I'm delighted to have you on board. Perhaps you could just introduce yourself and pose your question to Rob as the last act of this conversation.
Oh, is it going to be the last act?
It is indeed.
Okay, very good. My name is Deepak Gary. I'm a physician, actually, who's got an MD in both internal medicine as well as nephrology. I did most of my training at Harvard Medical School, at Brigham and Women's Hospital. I love Boston.
And where are you phoning from?
I'm signing in from Chicago.
Excellent.
Right. What's your question?
Oh, actually, it's a question that I had in the back of my mind for some time, and since this came up, that's fine. Some time ago, The Economist itself ran an article about India and China, comparing the two. I don't have the article with me. I don't know the name of the article, but it had a bounding Bengal tiger on the cover. One leader was devoted entirely to this issue, and there were numerous articles inside. The basic points being made were that China could not succeed in the long term. All right? Partly because of its repressive government, which would stifle growth and try to dictate areas in which growth need to occur in. Part of it because of the inverted pyramid population dynamics that China has. It has a small young population, one child, one person rule, and it then blossoms out so that you have numerous people at the base, which is up.
Oh dear.
Rob,
So the question is China versus India.
Yes.
The question is China versus India, which do we think is better and is going to succeed?
Yeah, over the long term. And actually, what interested me was The Economist changed its mind.
Oh, really? Well,
Yes.
I think that's the problem. We all change our minds because China's very...
In a pretty forceful manner, and you didn't acknowledge the other article at all.
I'm afraid I'm not sure. I probably wasn't here when that was written. My brief take on China, India.
My final write back on this issue was, hey, tut, you guys are like our Willy flip-flop mit-the-wit.
I think we're allowed to change our viewpoint, although I can't speak on this particular issue. I'll just give you my brief summary of the China, brief summary of the China-India comparison. Obviously, we're more inclined to like India in the West because it's a democracy. The problem with that, though, is that the Indian democracy doesn't deliver the things that democracies are supposed to. And it does in some areas, but not in others. And so you have to ask yourself the question, are you willing to give up certain rights in order to gain more economic progress? And some people would not be willing to do that, and they would probably go for India. But there's no doubt that China is zooming ahead of India economically, but it does that by suppressing people's right to speak. If they build a lot of roads and a lot of buildings, and that's a good thing, but if your house is in the way, then you're not going to have any recourse in order to stop that road being built. So you know, again, you can find whatever you want to prove whichever theory that you have. The question of whether, I mean, if you ask me if I would rather be a Chinese peasant or an Indian peasant, I wouldn't like to be either, actually, but I think there are certainly more opportunities in China. That's not to say there aren't a million problems, and it's not to say that the Chinese government isn't brutal in many, many ways, but there are sort of 200 million manufacturing jobs in China, and in India, I don't know the exact number, probably 40 or 50 million. The road out of poverty, which is an important one, I think is easier in China. And it messes with our heads a bit if we've had a liberal Western education that we could even consider that a one-party state would be better. I'm not saying it necessarily is, but I think we have to look at who's delivering. And obviously we have to question whether it's worth that. And you would find lots of different people analyzing China, of course, lots of different people within The Economist who might totally disagree, and on one level it pains me to say it, but I think I would rather be a Chinese peasant than I would an Indian one. So that tells you something about how I look at what is important if you're a person with no money and nothing at the grassroots level.
Thank you very much, Rob. That's where we're going to have to end this conversation. So thank you to Deepak for your question, and thanks also to Danny, Jeremy, and Javier for their questions and for joining us throughout this conversation. Our next Hangout will take place in October when Tom Standage, our digital editor and the editor of our Technology Quarterly supplement, will be answering your questions. Keep an eye on our website, or indeed join our page on Google Plus to find out more about when that's happening and what the topic will be. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to Rob for the time he's given us, and goodbye to you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.